All right, guys and girls, I hope you're as excited as I am to finish the Section 1 notes here. So let's pick up with Maryland, which was the very first proprietary colony, meaning it was given by King Charles I to George Calvert, the first Lord of Baltimore. A little bit about Calvert was that he was a devout Catholic and wanted to establish Maryland as a haven for English Catholics. And in order to recruit more people, the second Lord Baltimore, Cecil Calvert, granted freedom of worship for all Christians. So initially, Maryland begins as a Catholic safe haven, but it eventually welcomes all Christians. Calvert's also going to agree to a representative assembly. And Maryland, much like Virginia, is going to base their economy off of tobacco, which will also lead to later importation of slaves. While we're on the subject of Maryland, we'll answer question 5 right away in the review questions. Question 5 was, how did the establishment of Maryland differ from that of earlier English colonies? As mentioned before, Maryland was the first proprietary colony, unlike Virginia and Massachusetts, which were technically corporate or royal colonies. Proprietary colonies are either given to individuals by the crown to repay a debt or a gift of loyalty. They could also be purchased by wealthy individuals who had vast expenses to cover the colonization cost. Again, in Maryland's case, the colony was given to George Calvert by the crown to repay a debt because of King Charles I's sympathies to the Catholic minority in England, of which George Calvert belonged. Continuing with Connecticut, Connecticut began because a dissension within the Massachusetts Bay Colony emerged. In 1637, Puritans across the Connecticut River found the government in Boston too restrictive and created their own independent colony of Connecticut based at Hartford. Ironically, other Puritans found the Boston government not strict enough and created a more theocratic colony at New Haven. Eventually, they formed the formal government of their colony known as the Fundamental Order of Connecticut. Moving on to New Hampshire, not much to say other than it became a separate colony from Massachusetts under a royal governor in 1691. New York, a little bit more interesting here, was originally a Dutch colony established as a base for trade called New Amsterdam in New York City. In 1664, King Charles II gave New Amsterdam to his brother, the Duke of York, later King James II. They sent a fleet to take it from the Dutch, and there was very little resistance since the English promised to honor Dutch property. While the Dutch were a Protestant, New York became a haven for all religions. It was mainly home to German, French, Swedish, Portuguese, and English settlers. New Amsterdam also became an established base for the lucrative fur trade, Native Americans. Moving on to Rhode Island, again, very similar to Connecticut. Dissension within the Massachusetts Bay Colony emerged. Roger Williams, who was banished for promoting the concept of separation of church and state, established this new colony in Providence. Williams will later open up Rhode Island as a haven for religious dissenters and granted full liberty to people of any religious opinions. Now moving on to our home state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, much like Maryland, was established as a proprietary colony by William Penn as a haven for persecuted religious groups. The background is the king owed the Penn family money, which was paid in the form of land in North America. William Penn established the city of Philadelphia. A little bit about the Quakers, which Penn was a member of. Quakers were pacifist, meaning they did not believe in fighting or violence. They also did not believe in traditional church services and granted women equal footing, well ahead of their time. However, William Penn was receptive to all religious groups and even recruited all religious groups to help fill in their ranks. He also recruited lots of settlers from Germany. One other unique thing about William Penn and the settlement of Pennsylvania is they were the first and only colony to recognize the Indians' ownership of the land. And actually, Penn paid the Indians fairly graciously for the land in which Pennsylvania became, which also helped to establish trade long-term with the Indians in Pennsylvania. However, slavery will become a big part of the colony's economy, and Penn himself will also be reluctantly agree to the Charter of Liberties that established an elected legislature. Next colony and state, Delaware, which was actually created by the Charter of Liberties that William Penn reluctantly agreed to, consisted of the three most southern counties of Pennsylvania. The first colonizers of Delaware were Swedish and Finnish, but they were later joined by settlers of William Penn. Moving on to Carolina. Charles II rewarded 8 of his supporters and sought to secure England's land claim by creating a colony of Carolina. City of Charlestown, or Charleston, Carolina, was named the capital. In the north, most of the settlers were relatively poor white farmers from Virginia. The south was wealthy, driven by plantations and trade, and it was officially divided between North and South Carolina in 1729 by King George. The economy of the Carolinas was large-scale rice growing and sugar plantations, especially early on. Much of the colony's commercial success focused on the city and harbor at Charleston on trade with British Caribbean colonies. The last colony worth mentioning today is Georgia, which was founded in 1733 by James Oglethorpe. He was a war hero. He founded Georgia as a place where the poorest of England's poor could find new lives. Also, England wanted a stronger frontier with Spanish Florida. Since most of the settlers of Georgia were debtors and their alternative was prison, they were also willing soldiers. However, while Georgia was not a religious colony and most of the settlers of Georgia were not very religious, it did exclude Catholics out of the fear that they might be more loyal to Spanish Florida and Spain. Just to wrap up here today, we'll cover the last 3 discussion questions. Starting with question 6. Why was Pennsylvania known as the peaceful colony? Well, Pennsylvania was known as a peaceful colony because it was settled by a group known as the Quakers, led by William Penn. As we mentioned before, Quakers were a pacifist Protestant sect who did not believe in traditional church services and also granted women equal right. And while Penn did recruit other religious groups to help build a new colony, they all had to follow his rule to peaceful trade interaction with the Native Americans. And as I mentioned before as well, Penn was the only one to outright pay the Indians for the land they took. Question 7. What role did religion play in shaping the development of the British colonies? Well, religion played a large role, as we talked about yesterday in class, in shaping the development of the British colonies. Massachusetts, you had the Puritans and Pilgrims, who established a strict Protestant colony, which, because of, led to the establishment of 2 separate colonies, Rhode Island by Roger Williams, because the Massachusetts colony was too strict, and Connecticut because it wasn't strict enough. Then in Maryland, you had the establishment of a Catholic colony, Pennsylvania Quaker colony, both as religious minorities in England, but allowed and tolerated more religious groups in North America. Lastly, to wrap up here, question 8, historical interpretation. What was the nature of slavery in British North America before the 1680s? Well, while slavery did exist in British North American colonies before the 1680s, it was not prominent. Only around 20,000 slaves in the colonies by the end of the century. Most labor was performed by indentured servants or poor English colonists. The slaves that did work in the colonies did mostly work on farm or as servants in the cities of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. It will not be until the late 17th, early 18th century with the eruption of tobacco and cotton plantations that the need for slavery will increase. Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to me again. I will see you all tomorrow.